ostensibly, our topic is the telecommunications infrastructure, the invisible resource. But the reality is we're going to talk about Ellie a little bit. This is, by the way, an incredible career that we just heard about, but also how you've impacted us personally. And I can speak for myself, but we actually had a conversation before. But you and the Institute have done in the way you've affected our lives as well as the world is actually quite extraordinary. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Alex and I are going to try to moderate a panel of people who are never shy. And so it's actually going to be a conversation and looking at some of as the infrastructure is the prerequisite for everything else we're going to talk about during the day on this substance. Alex, did you want to maybe?
Yep. I think one of the things that we wanted to kick off the panel is not like we said, we don't like all these classic bios, Babas here and all these kinds of ways. But I think it's really important is, let's say, how did we connect to Ellie and maybe just start off with like where the impact was. And I'll never forget, it was one of the most unusual interviews I ever had. I'd come up to Columbia, interview to be Ellie's assistant. And not only was I there, but there was another candidate there. So Ellie was already implementing his competition policy. And I didn't really know if I wanted the job, but the competitive aspect made me go for it. Then the next thing you know, I guess I won. I don't know what I won, but in retrospect, it's been great. And I think one of the best lessons I learned from Ellie was it's not always the answer that's the starting point, but it's asking the right questions. I can't remember how many what will be the impact of the internet on financial services, on media, and all these different types of things. So Ellie was always seeking the questions, but he also taught us like, there's not an answer. And I loved how he was always bringing together the academia with the regulators, with the business, because at the end of the day, we talked about like saying, bringing all these stakeholders together, Vince had said, you do need all three to really come out on the right side. So I think that was something that always stuck with me and I think has influenced in many ways.
Yeah, and for me, right, on some characteristics of what's really important as it differentiates people just as a general matter is curiosity, right? Ellie is one of the most curious. Take that any way you want. People, I know a lot, curiosity, right? But also not being risk averse, right? Ellie was always open to asking questions that you didn't know the answers to, right? And it was being able to take risks. Some things work, some things don't, right? And riding, and the other big characteristic of what people who excite me is leaning into serendipity. One thing leads to the next. It's hard to plan out, right? Because I met you for the first time 42 years ago. So it was 1982. And we were both asking this question that people told us it was a stupid question because both of us were looking at the intersection of cable TV and telecom. And both of us were working on the question of, could cable TV ever provide telecom? And the answer was, oh, never. And could telecom networks or telecom companies get into the content business or video? And people would say no. And both of us were tilting at windmills. And I remember that first conversation here on campus, right? And that was, for me, a real game changer. And as, you know, the dean and Vin have said, one of the things, and Alex, one of the things that Ellie is great at is connecting dots that people don't even see the dots and being able to look around corners. And those are some of the things I think that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the telecom. Maybe we'll get to the telecom infrastructure, this invisible resource, but the entire day flows. And that's one of the things that, Ellie, your contribution intellectually to policy, to improving things, making the world a better place, has just been enormous because of your openness, curiosity, leaning into serendipity, not being afraid of risk, and so on. Johannes, I don't know if you want to.
I can just, Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University, can just share my origin story with Ellie. And at some level, he is indirectly responsible that I ended up in the United States. I was a graduate student in Vienna, Austria, and interested in telecommunication information policy issues. And for some reason, I was interested in what happened in the United States. Part of it was substantively related to what happened here. I had the sense that communications was more efficient, was more innovative in the United States, was better organized, and became interested in this model of external regulation at the time. So this is the 1980s, right? Gotta set yourself back in time. But I was also interested in American music. I was interested in jazz. I was interested in rock music. So I was a big Grateful Dead fan, for example. And Southern rock was big on my hit list. And so I was looking for ways to spend some time in the United States, to learn more about information communication policy, but also do it in places that would enable me to nourish my other interests. And so I tried to figure out my way to UC Berkeley as a visiting student. And then I was looking for a place on the East Coast. And the only person I knew was Ellie, because I had read his book on telecommunications regulation from 1982, I think, one of the first volumes out of your productive career. And I found it very interesting. So I reached out and surprisingly, he responded and said, okay, if you have money, I had funding from various sources of grants that I put together to come here. There was no incremental cost to CITI or anything. I just needed a letter that I was welcome to come. And so that's how I ended up in New York. Turns out that Ellie had a sort of instrumental interest on top of being welcoming. He also wrote this book on telecommunications in Europe, where there was a chapter on Austria. He was happy to have somebody who could provide feedbacks and comments on the chapter, which I know so later. And so that's how it all started. And what always fascinated me, I couldn't express it at that time, I think, but in now looking back, your ability, as Bob said, to put the dots together, to think in bigger contexts and think in bigger historical contexts. I mean, so our media system, our academic system is to some degree very sort of short-term oriented, right? And these are sort of social, technological processes that do not necessarily happen in short terms. And if we focus on the moment, we typically get the big picture wrong. And you always looked at those bigger arcs of history and of developments. And that was fascinating from the beginning. And I'll say more about other aspects of your life, but it's been very inspiring. You've been a role model and a mentor and a great colleague and friend, and I'm really happy to be here.
Erik.
Okay, it's my great honor to be here and to say a few words on how I got to know Ellie and how he's contributed to my life. My name is Erik Bohlin at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, and also now at Ivey Business School in Canada, at Western University, Ontario. And just the first encounter, I was the new PhD student, just half a year into my time, ITS, International Telecommunication Society, 1988, MIT in Boston. I missed his presentation, but I looked through, I was manically trying to gather all the papers that were distributed on all the tables there. And I found this paper on open network access. And that was the most fascinating paper of all the papers in the conference. And just to say, maybe I'll elaborate later on how that was at that time a little bit dramatic idea of open these networks, these telecom networks. And this idea of open networks has been part of Ellie's analysis, also up to recent TPRC conferences on AI and openness in AI market structures, powerful idea. And for instance, I was during my PhD interviewing here at New York Telephone Company in 1992, and they were sweating about Commissioner Noam and his idea of co-location. Network engineers here were really frustrated about this idea of open networks in their field and the commissioner there. So that was just the first encounter, and I follow Ellie's contributions in great admiration and appreciation. Thank you.
Raul.
Yeah, I brought my cheap book here. I originally heard of CITI and Ellie Noam when I was finishing my PhD with, hello? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I originally heard of Ellie and CITI when I was finishing my PhD with Ivey de Solapool at MIT. And he mentioned something about this guy at Columbia Business School that had created this new research center that was hosted at a business school, which for me was puzzling because I would have expected economics department or poli sci. And this was interesting because he was trying to build bridges and multidisciplinary bridges. That's why it was hosted at, and they didn't mention it to as well, is while hosted at the business school, it was trying to bring in legal perspectives, economic perspectives, engineering ones. And I thought it was quite interesting as a concept. And obviously, Ithio totally endorsed it at the time. But then I stopped. When I graduated, I actually went to the dark side and joined consulting, and rather than finding a job in academia. And 16 years later, I published a paper on, this was the dot-com crisis. And everyone was struggling about what happened here and overvaluation of assets, stranded capital, the usual things that one might consider. And I said, there are clearly economies of scale here. And I drew some charts and I showed that it prompts for consolidation. So I get a call from Eli because he was starting a program called at the time, I believe, something like Remedies to the Telecommunications Industry. And I said, this chart is interesting, but maybe you might want to join it. And so I talked to the partners, and the consulting firms and law firms, billable hours are the dominant paradigm by which you judge performance. And they actually, to my surprise, they say it might make sense that you actually start linking up with CITI and LE, partly because they were recognizing they didn't know what the hell was going on and how to continue advising clients. So I started, and that was the beginning of the relationship. I worked on that. I worked on economies of scale. I worked on other research projects, and I think that link between the activity that I was doing on the consulting side and on the research and policy has been dominant in my life. So for that, I really thank you for considering bringing that perspective to my work.
Picking up a little bit on what each of the panelists up here have said, one of the things that we can't forget, Ellie, is that you were not just an academic in the clouds and providing advice and insight to people on the ground. You were a regulator, right? You actually applied doing here at the New York State Commission at a critical time of introducing competition, of dealing with moving from monopoly to competition, and what can make that work. The other thing, being at the business school, a huge advantage was bringing the people together. So at that time, I was a policymaker in the FCC, but bringing together the policy community, the academic community, people who were thinking about these things, but also the investment community, and the companies actually building and operating, but then the people who were making the investments. Because from a policy perspective, it didn't make any difference what we thought we were doing, but if the people who had to write the checks, if they didn't open up their checkbooks and write the checks, nothing would have happened. And so bringing together in a very credible, neutral forum, the industry, the policymakers, the investors, the engineers, the people who are innovating, bringing all of that together actually led to significant positive developments that you helped accelerate by getting people to talk to each other and with one another, not at one another, right? And that's actually a pretty unique thing if you look at that over history. So maybe we can jump in to some of the...
So I think this is where I think we had, let's say, a very long run of CITI and Ellie and the network. And now that I'm, let's say, more on the, let's say, business side, the question I wanted to just tease the panel with is, where were we successful? Where do we hit OKRs? What did we deliver for innovation, for customers, for businesses? And where do we see things may have been a little softer in terms of, let's say, content regulation or other types of things? So maybe, and I think also with roads, and it's not just one picture. We can say things are great in Germany, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's great in other parts of the world. So I think we can also talk about where things went well in different, let's say, regions, as well as where things went well.
I can start again. Depends on what do you mean by we. So let me start by we, meaning CITI and its work. And I think one of the interesting things about Ellie's big vision is that he raised important topics at a time when not everybody was ready for them. And some of them turned out to be really prescient anticipations of what might happen. and others are still waiting to be honored. Right? So, for example, in the first group, Erik put his work on, or the work that you did and CITI contributed in conferences and workshops and so forth on the notion of common carriage and its impending doom, driven by the diversification of networks, driven by business needs, driven by consumer needs, by customer needs, and so forth. And very few people saw that as clearly at that point, but that has worked out over time as something that happened to the network, and it has actually created lots of benefits. I think a lot of innovation, a lot of customer benefits are tied to the diversification of the network infrastructure, the heterogeneity of the infrastructure, but it also has created headaches, right? Because some of the original principles of common carriage, of non-discrimination, of universal access to services, these have been violated, or there's a tension between those. And so we have big discussions on equity and inclusion that are still pending and that are ongoing. And just to bring in a second example, where I thought you had a incredibly insightful paper was the one on real-time spectrum access, the spectrum tokens, right? Where Tom Hazel, I'm not sure that he's here or not, he called it in a comment, he called it spectrum flash dance, right? And that appeared in 1998. And the idea was that spectrum would become an open access resource rather than one that is driven by spectrum auctions that then create proprietary usage rights. Now that vision has so far not materialized, but we're inching there, I would say. And I think the COSIS paper on the FCC that led to spectrum auctions took 36 years from the time we actually came up with the idea until Congress authorized the FCC to use spectrum auctions. So I think you still have, where are we? We still have a few years to go, right? But there's actually a paper 3 years ago that uses exactly your token model and then designs an algorithm that can be used for real-time spectrum access along the ways that you have described. Interestingly, that paper does not cite your paper, and which also shows sort of part of the academic world. Ideas travel directly and indirectly and frequently because information is free, it's a public good, can be used and reused, right? We lose the context of the link to the originator of the knowledge. And but they have impact regardless, right? And I'll end with this. I worked in the federal government for a year and a half. I was at the Federal Communications Commission. And knowledge influences policy choices very in multiple ways, right? Rarely does it influence policy making because somebody had a solution to a problem. Right? It travels indirectly through inspiring others who then make other arguments, form new consensus. And so the diffusion of knowledge into politics is often very indirect. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of your ideas really made an impact on that. And what more can one want from a rich academic career than not only being a brilliant academic, but also somebody who's worked impact.
Yes, wonderful. I would like to just continue a little bit on this, what Johannes just mentioned, and the idea of openness, open network access, as I mentioned earlier, which was a successful idea and also creating a lot of sweats for the telcos. But your paper 98 on open access in Spectrum is still out there to be implemented and created a lot of interesting debate at that time. One of the co-author, one of the seminar participants in 98, Peter Crampton, he has developed recently an open access model for wholesale for satellite markets, wholesale satellite markets up in the sky, which refers a little bit to your ideas as well. And it's looking to, so that's just one way of pushing forward that idea, actually in Spectrum as well. And another theme which will come up later in the afternoon, I'm sure, your view of open access, we could call it, to freedom of speech. And that is also, as mentioned a little bit in the introduction here, increasing challenge, you could say. But we have an interesting, which I hope we will address, Supreme Court decision last year on the net choice versus Paxton and Moody, where we have thoughtful elaborations on what to do with freedom of speech in an age of AI, both AI content moderation and AI in terms of generating content, and what to do in how to implement your ideas on open access there is also interesting in connection with the whole market structure for AI. So that's a fascinating topic let's see if we get back to that.
Yeah. So when I got the call from Eli in 2001, he raised the concept that the industry should migrate to an industry structure of 2.5 players. And it was a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. He was saying primarily there's going to be cable and telco competition and wireless competition, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. I would agree with that. Now, how has that materialized? Are we in the midst of that? Are people recognizing that contribution? I think that the picture is mixed. I think clearly after that, a number of papers have been written, and I've seen a lot coming from Europe, moving from 4 to 3. There are even people raising the issue of 3 to 2 as to what it means in terms of industry structure. But it's moving in that direction. But what I'm finding, though, it goes back to the issue of knowledge and policy, is that there's no perfect diffusion of knowledge in the policymaking field, and particularly overseas. I found myself arguing the issue of 2.5 industry structure over and over again and explaining what it means and showing my chart of 2002 on economies of scale, explaining this is the way things work. And I think that to some degree, particularly in the developing world, which I tend to work quite a bit, is that people are somewhat conditioned by the frameworks that were developed originally in the 90s and 80s. And there hasn't been a perfect diffusion of what research has triggered recently in order to frame the discussion in different terms. Oh yeah, there's 4 players. We need 4 players or 3 players to guarantee competition, or look, there's enough competitive dynamics along that type of industry configuration. And still, I don't know whether it's an intention or whether there's no perfect diffusion of knowledge. But when it comes into the geographic diffusion of knowledge, still we have a very imperfect network in terms of people understanding the research that is being conducted in places like CITI and moved into the real world. I think that there's some work to do there.
Picking up again, but moving to the substance and away from just Eli, although Eli's work and the CITI fold back into that. One of the things that CITI has done in terms of the research and then applying it to the industry, but also to policy, is about competition and the power of competition. And the flip side of that is the power of incumbency. So incumbents always come to the regulator and say, oh, if you open this up, if you have open network architecture, or if you have incremental cost interconnection, it's going to be end of the world. It's going to be end of civilization. The new entrants always come in and say, if you don't make changes, we're dead. We can't even get started. And you're going to lose all the benefits of innovation. The incumbents want to use regulation as a shield. The new entrants want to use regulators and regulation as a sword to open things up. And one of the things that actually makes the difference are the new entrants that people do not foresee as having impact. A lot of the work and conversations here have foreshadowed that. So in some ways it's policy, what I call policy by stealth, because people didn't think it was important. At the time of the breakup, AT&T gave away its cellular licenses because it didn't think it was important, and it gave it to the baby bells that they didn't think would be important. All right. And when the CEO of Pacific Telesis, decided to leave and go start up what became AirTouch, which became nationwide and then merged with Verizon and Vodafone and all of that, his fellow Bell operating company CEOs told him, you're a fool. What are you doing? You're the president of a Bell company. These wireless things are toys. What are you doing? He saw what could happen and the notion of wireless entry to compete with fixed line. If you look in emerging markets, the assumption was there would never be cell phones in emerging markets. It was only for rich people in rich countries. Nobody foresaw prepaid packages for data or for voice. And it had the fixed line monopoly operators in emerging markets the PTTs at the time understood the threat of mobile, never would have developed in the emerging markets. But because they didn't think it was important, they let new entrants get those licenses. And it's the similar thing where the Bell Atlantic, Ray Smith, the head of Bell Atlantic, and those guys invented DSL basically, kept it off the market because they didn't want to cannibalize their T1 business. But it wasn't until the cable companies came in with DOCSIS, with data, that the Bell company said, oh, we actually need to compete. So there's this cycle. And what we're seeing today, especially in emerging markets, is how the LEOs, Starlink, but not just Starlink, are competing with mobile operators, right? And while the technology, it may be invisible for those of us in developed markets where we can take it for granted, it's like turning on a light switch. It's there and it works. There's still 2.5 billion people not connected. And the question is, what's going to get them connected? So for those of us who have it, the technology on which everything else is built may be invisible because it's assumed. When I was at Cisco, we used to joke that we built the plumbing for the internet. And just like with plumbing, as long as it worked, nobody noticed or cared. But if it broke, just like with plumbing, you call the plumber because, it's actually a mess. There are places where you cannot even assume that those things exist. And so there's this dynamic between entry and competition, new technologies, and the policy intersecting together. And the kind of work that was done here at CITI informed that process and informed the investors, the people who were writing checks for the new entrants. And that became extremely powerful. Going back to the question here in terms of the telecom, the infrastructure, the market structure, it's the what's next, because this is one of the things that CITI has always looked at, which is the what's next, the around the corner. So I'm curious what you guys see.
Little flash dance and mix it up all that.
Yeah, I was thinking about Starlink and the LEOs because that's precisely where people say, is this the end of competition? I say, no, not at all. And I actually do work overseas with competition commissions, and I show them what Starlink is doing in terms of gaining share, to the point that they're constrained by the capacity and the speed at which they are putting satellites in the sky to feed that requirement, and how they are moving prices down in terms of like smart network cost to zero once they have the network. And this is competing and gaining share. The nature of innovation and competition is not dead. It's just it has changed character. And in fact, what is occurring is, at least, and this is, I'm sorry to go a little bit back in the time, but what I find myself in terms of explaining this, particularly when I came to AI, is I find myself going back to Stigler's original article in 1951 on the division of labor and Williamson's theory on transaction costs to explain how the value chain is transforming itself, how people forward integrate, backward integrate, building of specialists. And those things are still very prevalent from a theoretical standpoint. I think that we shouldn't forget those guys, because those guys set us a framework that could help us understand a lot of the things that are occurring. And to some degree, I gotta say, the 2.5 industry configuration of some of the theories that were developed then are still very prevalent, very much existing, and we shouldn't trash in a way a view of the newer. I think that the original ones from an economic standpoint are pretty much, very much valid today, and I think we need to apply them and constantly think about them. Yeah.
Alex, look, what you do in your day job. I'm not quite sure what that is. No, yeah. I'm wireless at BMW. But the fact is, you're building applications on top of the connectivity.
Absolutely. Even if you talk about, let's say, self-driving, let's say real-time maps, real-time data, we're all depending. I can just say, again, in terms of innovation and evolution, I think to me, let's say, competition and open access has really transformed and extended out. So for BMW, I have to say our purchasing department is probably one of the most difficult people you'll ever want to deal with. And we have 20 million cars around the world that are connected to the internet. And the ability to have eSIM and soft SIM basically means where what used to take hardware replacement to go in and change SIM cards or even change whole modules, now we could basically have the opportunity to compete carriers against one another just by some software over the air. And that's fundamental. These types of innovations, they're all connected together that also extend out to benefit to corporates, public, and that's just one example from BMW. I think one of the things that just came up is I think from my report card is I think the huge success of the work done here on open access and policy has taken us here. And the question I would come back to the panel is like, so what are the risks around the corner? Where do we start to see slippage, have lots of, let's sort of say, mergers happening every day? At what point do we go from these things? And it's great to have, let's sort of say, hey, I've got a wireless carrier and I've got a cable operator and I've got a telephone provider. But then when they all become the same company, do you really have the benefits of the competition in there? And it's like, say, there's a good point about Starlink as they bring it in. So are we going to be able to sustain the current trajectory, and what needs to be done to ensure that, or where do you see potential cracks down the road?
Can I just maybe go one step back and then come back to the question and talk about this notion of invisible infrastructure for 1 second, right? Because I think we have to be careful what we are talking about. For one, if we, as you alluded to, if you think about infrastructure as a resource that we take for granted, and we only notice it when it's not there, right? In that sense, it is invisible. But if you talk to people who currently protest against data centers, they will not say that this is an invisible infrastructure. It's very tangible, it's very there. And there's all sorts of gradations in between. And I think the best way, in my view, to think about infrastructure and the applications and services that are on top of it is probably still that model that Bresnan and Breitenberg offers of general purpose infrastructures, because it has like a two-way feedback loops, right? There's an influence that the capabilities of that infrastructure have. It enables applications and services on top of that infrastructure. But also the demands of services then feed back to the needs that we pose on the infrastructure, right? And become a force for better improved infrastructure. And it's that incessantly operating feedback loop between those multiple layers of the infrastructures that has actually brought us to a situation where we currently have a very heterogeneous and very diverse infrastructure. And one of the challenges is how to really make it seamless, right? In your car, whatever the applications are, that will be a bigger challenge. And part of the diversity is driven by entrepreneurship and competition, right? And as you said, the incumbent will always try to sort of abuse regulators to protect the incumbency. And that's probably the legitimate goal, right? As the newcomers will try to do the opposite. And so what you need to have is smart regulators in the middle. And the regulatory system has sometimes responded openly to information and knowledge and invited people in to explore those issues, and sometimes it has not. And we are currently in a phase where it is not really listening and is not inviting people in. And it was very difficult when I was at the FCC, but this was the Biden administration. It was difficult to orchestrate this sharing of knowledge that would have helped come up with better policies. And so this is another type of invisible infrastructure. As Vint Cerf mentioned, he said, what's the role of a non-technical academic? There is the physical infrastructure of the network and the data centers and whatever it might be, but there's the invisible infrastructure of our knowledge, how to use it. We see the Benton Foundation here, they're worried about digital equity, digital skills, for example. That's a very strong invisible infrastructure that they need in addition to the physical infrastructure or the management principles, the routines that companies have. And we know from innovation research that those really multiply the potential impacts of infrastructures, right? And so we should think of infrastructure probably in the broader context. I'll leave it for here for now. I'll leave the risks for maybe the next one.
Okay, I would like to also build on several themes here and just to give a little bit report card from Canada, where I am situated now for a few years, because there it turns out that what you could call old discussions are very active and kicking and alive. I've been there for 3 years now, but as you may know, there is, first of all, politicians can go asking for votes by promising to lower telecom costs in Canada. That doesn't really happen in Sweden nor in Europe, but maybe for energy, but not in telecom. So there is a problem in Canada and different ways to resolve it. But surprisingly, and against all stakeholders, in the very recent regulatory situation of mandated access to fiber, one player, Telus, has chose to become a new entrant in the regions of Bell and Rogers and so on. And that created a big consternation and a big lash from all the players, but the regulator was happy and also the Competition Bureau. And so there we have a new scene being played out on this mandated access and openness and the service competition and infrastructure, and also the concerns that Bob raised about if we have open networks here, we will die. So that's playing out in full force. So there we see the old ideas of telecom economics still being alive. But of course, if we look for the future, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit, some of the Elias emphasized that telecom economics is still alive and kicking, but in other areas, big tech, AI, there we also have these discussions to be had. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm picking up on some of the themes and linking back to the issue of the link between academic research and policymaking. And I'm going to bring an anecdote here just to illustrate my point. This is at the time that Blair Levine was leading the development of the National Broadband Plan in the US, probably a pretty old history. And I believe it was the FCC that convened a group of academics to DC to talk to Blair about what we saw, provide our input. And Blair was bombarded by all these academics saying, why didn't you look at the economics of supply and the demand and the pricing and all these analyses that should be made? And at some point, Blair said, guys, the problem that we have is the timing of research is not the same as the timing of policymaking. I welcome you in terms of informing us of what we need to do, but unfortunately, the evidence that you are generating doesn't match with the needs that we have in the policy domain. And I think that's a pretty key issue that we need to think of what we're going to do going forward, because what I see as a danger is somewhat that the public intellectual posturing or the Substack candy that is sometimes being published does not replace the hard slogging work of dealing with data sets and econometric modeling and generating evidence. And that takes time. So I don't know how to handle the contradictions of what that means, but we have to recognize that while we all agree about the connectivity, it's not that easy to actually deliver on it.
Yeah, so one of the things, again, coming back to why CITI has had such great impact is if there's an issue currently pending, whether it was at the New York State Commission up in Albany or at the FCC or PTS in Sweden, if an issue is already there, the people who are advocating are locked in, they have their positions, it's near term, right? The place where I've seen the more fundamental academic research, the kind of work that Ellie has done here, is looking at the kind of what's next questions, the things that are 3 to 5 years out, and doing the work so that, and forecasting what the issues might be. So one of the things that we did at the FCC when I was there, and Ellie and some of you were involved in that, was bring academics in to hear from the FCC what we were thinking of next generation issues, wanting to know from you what you're around the corner, because what I wanted was your graduate students to start working on questions that we would be confronted with in 3 to 5 years. Because that's where the data actually, because you've thought about it, you've already done the work, you've done the analysis. Look, the book that Ellie's handing out is Video 2040. We're looking out, he wrote it in 2025, so looking out 15 years. And thinking about, when we talked a little bit about it as you were doing it, right? And the intersection even of AI and video, what is video? What does that mean? But beginning to look at the next round or even beyond that, the questions, because that's where going back to the non-technical academics, can actually have, I think, impact on not just the policy process, but on the industry development, the investment, right? What are they thinking about? Because everybody in industry is trying to get a leg up. Can I be first? Can I innovate? Can I be first mover and get an advantage? So you're needing to think about what's next. And that's why having CITI, frankly, as part of the business school, I think is, again, it's a huge feature, not a bug. So that you made me think about it. That's how I think we need to think about it. And because if it's an issue that is in front of Blair as he is 6 months or 4 months away, and Blair's going to be here later today if he's not here yet, but he will be. He has to deliver a report to the commission, right, in 60 days or 120 days. It's too late to go back to do the research. So we need to be thinking forward. We need to be future-proof to help them become future-proof.
So I think since we've gotten the signal for 5 minutes left, I have to respect my successor.
Jason has the hardest job.
Yeah, for sure. So I think maybe we have 1 minute. And if you want to, you can take a choice. You can say, hey, what do you think's around the corner, or just add another comment. So maybe a minute left.
Yeah, so let me talk about some of the risks that I currently see that I think the academic community also doesn't address very well. And that is that we think very frequently in sort of short-term observations and don't necessarily see the longer-term horizon. And I think that is true for the academic world as it is for business and for the media and public policy. And I really don't know how we can get to this broader thinking. And so I do think that sort of a center, an independent center like CITI, they are important. I'm actually in a bizarre situation. I'm running one, right? We are trying to do this, but it's very difficult to get funding for these longer term projects that we envision, this bigger thinking. And but some of the risks that I see is that there's too little diversity. And let me give you one example. Let's say if you think about AI research, especially foundation models, right? There's just a few players currently who invest in that type of research. And they all literally invest in the same direction. And that is a recipe for failure, right? The academic space has essentially been eliminated from that type of research because there's not the funding. That's mostly industry. And it's mostly happening in the US and to some degree in China. Right? Europe is far left behind in the research space. I worry about these issues way more than about the 2.5 carriers or the 3 carriers, because these will be the tidal waves of the future. And thinking about market structure and competition is important, but it's the rear view mirror in many of those issues. And I really think, as you said, we need to have that forward-looking agenda. And we'll pick up a little bit of your mantle, Ellie, if we can, but it will be impossible to fill those shoes that you're leaving behind.
I will just continue a little bit on the research outlooks, research issues that Johannes mentioned. And I'm editor-in-chief of Telecommunications Policy since 2009. And for a number of years, we had a stable number of submissions, 200 to 300 per year. And COSI, lots of good work, but of course, a lot of rejection. And then suddenly, a few years ago, 50% increase, 50% increase, 50% increase. Now we are last year 1,800 submissions, and the absolute majority, dominant majority, is from China, and many of them are good in econometrics and so on, but it's a huge type of salami slicing type of very marginal contributions, and this is not a problem just for telecom policy. The scene of science discourse is changing the whole situation for engineering, for so many aspects, that massive contributions and in some marginal way, very proficient. So I'm struggling to see new novel thinking and also to have this openness in science, which is also now in debated or pressured in the United States, not just in China. Of course, we have a lot of papers that cite the PRC wishes on how China should develop as a starting discourse of the papers. And so that openness in science is being challenged also here. So that's a big problem and challenge.
Okay, so I'm going to end in a dark note. Going back to the point about forecasting and looking at the future, I see that there was a generation of researchers, and I'm going back, so you might not know the names, but Ethiel de Solapool, Eli Noam, Edwin Parker at Stanford, that were pretty much into looking at the future and understanding that. I don't know whether academia is capable of regenerating that kind of perspective. I think we have some obstacles there and challenges on how we recreate that capability. And why I totally agree with you. The problem is that's a challenge ahead of us.
I see that as well. I think our time is up. Before we have Jason come up here and try to pull us off, I want to thank you very much. This has been a great conversation.